Hello and welcome to IAMC TV, radio, and podcast. We're exploring the history of Nigeria today on Understanding Our History, a nation with a really fascinating and diverse past.
Absolutely, and it goes back a lot further than many people realize.
Yeah, I think when we say we're going way back, we really mean way back this time.
No kidding. Think Paleolithic era, 500,000 BC. That's when the first humans were in the area, according to archaeological records at least.
Wow, 500,000 BC. That's just mind-blowing to think about.
It is. And they weren't just surviving, they were building distinct cultures shaped by the environment around them. Take the Niger Delta, for example, a network of waterways and creeks. It was central to the Ijaw people.
So the whole way of life for the Ijaw revolved around this delta.
Pretty much, yeah. Using canoes for transportation, they built their economy around things like fishing and salt making.
It's incredible how adaptable humans are, you know? Finding ways to survive and thrive in such different landscapes.
Yeah. You say that again, and it's not just the land that's diverse in Nigeria, it's the people, too. Hundreds of languages and unique cultures, from the Hausa and Fulani in the north to the Yoruba in the west, and of course, the Igbo, Ijaw, and others in the east.
It's like this giant cultural tapestry woven together over centuries.
You got it. And what's often overlooked is that even before European contact, many smaller ethnic groups, sometimes called minorities, had their own ways of governing themselves.
Yeah, I think there's this misconception that pre-colonial Africa was all simple tribal societies, but you're saying there was way more to it.
Way more. These groups might have been different from the larger, more well-known ones, but they were just as complex. They had systems for maintaining order, resolving disputes, and making decisions. For example, councils of elders or chiefs were common, and leadership was often based on lineage or specific initiations.
So not just about who was strongest or most powerful.
Nope. These societies really valued consensus and shared responsibility. Decisions were usually made collectively, respecting the wisdom and experience of the community.
I never really thought about it that way.
And then you have things like age grade systems, especially prominent among certain groups. They were responsible for maintaining order, sanitation, even defense.
Hold on, you're saying these age grade systems were like a defense force?
Essentially, yes. They organized and mobilized the community. Especially during times of conflict, it just goes to show their level of organization.
That's really remarkable. Are there any specific examples of these pre-colonial structures?
Sure. The Jukun people had a unique socio-political structure. They had autonomous chieftaincies, but they all recognized the Aku of Wukari as the supreme spiritual authority.
So like a spiritual leader who influenced all the Jotun community?
Yeah, exactly. It shows this really interesting blend of political and religious power. Local chiefs were selected by their communities, but the Aku's installation was a whole ceremony, with gifts and ritual objects solidifying their authority and how interconnected the Jukun people were.
It's amazing how these aspects of society were all woven together.
It really is, and this sophisticated system, along with others, was disrupted when the British arrived in the 19th century, leading to formal colonial rule in 1900.
Right, colonialism. I'm sure that had a huge impact.
A major turning point. The British came in with their own ideas about governing Nigeria. They divided it into protectorates and implemented indirect rule.
I remember reading about indirect rule. It was supposed to be less disruptive, right? Working through the existing local leaders.
That was the idea, but of course it had its own consequences. Some unintended, some not beneficial for all groups.
So even though they were trying to work within the system, they still ended up changing things.
Exactly, and a lot of times it led to the further marginalization of those smaller groups we talked about.
So it wasn't just about the British taking over. They also reshaped the power dynamics within Nigerian society.
You got it. And unsurprisingly, this didn't go over well with everyone, especially in the north, where the Hausa Fulani gained more power under indirect rule. A lot of the smaller ethnic groups felt sidelined and started pushing for recognition and a fairer share of power.
So the seeds of discontent were planted during the colonial period.
You could say that, and this discontent definitely didn't disappear with Nigerian independence. It became even more pronounced in the years that followed.
We've covered a lot of ground, from ancient origins to the complexities of colonialism, but this is only the beginning, right? We still need to explore what happened after independence.
Absolutely, that's when things get even more interesting. Because the struggle for equality and a place at the table for all Nigerians, no matter their ethnicity, well, that's a story that continues to unfold to this very day.
It's a great point. We've seen how the past shapes the present. And for our listeners, we'll be back in just a moment to continue exploring Nigeria's history. Stick around. You know, before we jump into post-independence Nigeria, I'm curious about these minority groups and their movements. We talked about how they were marginalized, but what did they actually do about it?
Well, they didn't just sit back and accept it. They got organized, they mobilized, they demanded to be heard.
They fought back against it.
Exactly. Remember those three key movements we mentioned earlier? They became this force for change.
Remind me, which ones were they again?
You had the Calabar-Goja River State movement in the east, then the Benin Delta State movement, later the Midwest movement in the west, and the Middle Belt movement in the north.
So a real nationwide movement.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just abstract principles either. It was about concrete issues, fairer representation, control over resources, and a say in how their communities were run.
So it wasn't just about having a seat at the table, it was about having a voice.
Precisely. And those voices got louder over time. They held rallies, petitions, even threatened to boycott elections if their demands weren't met.
Sounds like they were making a real impact. Did the British even notice?
Oh, they noticed. The pressure was building. They had issues elsewhere in their empire too, so they realized they had to do something.
What did they do?
They set up a commission, the Willing Commission, in 1957.
What was the point of that?
To look into the fears and grievances of these minority groups, see what could be done.
Did they find anything?
Their findings were pretty groundbreaking. They confirmed what these groups had been saying. Those fears of marginalization, they were legitimate. The political structures weren't protecting them.
So not just complaining for no reason, the commission backed them up.
Exactly. And that was huge. Gave their demands weight, set the stage for future efforts.
So the Willing Commission, even though it was British, kind of foreshadowed the challenges of an independent Nigeria.
You could say that. It highlighted those fault lines, and those wouldn't disappear with independence.
We're getting close to independence, but the minority question is still unresolved.
Oh, very much so. And as we'll see, it becomes a defining challenge for the new nation.
Can we go back to something you said earlier about these groups demanding control over resources? What did that look like?
Sure. Remember how we talked about the environment shaping life in Nigeria? Those environments also held different resources.
I'm guessing oil plays a role here.
You bet. The discovery of oil in the Niger Delta in the 1950s changed everything.
So not just political power anymore.
Now it's economic, too. These groups felt they weren't getting a fair share.
So they saw that wealth as rightfully theirs.
Many did. They were the ones dealing with the environmental damage. The profits were going elsewhere.
I can see how that would cause resentment.
It did. And this resource control issue, it becomes a major flashpoint in Nigerian politics. Conflicts, protests, even armed rebellions.
It's amazing how something like oil, which we think of as good, can be so divisive.
Definitely. It's a reminder that resources can be a double-edged sword. And in Nigeria, it got tangled up with the struggle for justice, both political and economic.
Okay, so we've got tensions. The minority question is still there. Now oil wealth is added in. What happens when Nigeria finally gets its independence?
Things don't suddenly become peaceful, that's for sure. The challenges get even more complex as this new nation tries to move forward.
Sounds like we're entering a whole new chapter.
We are, and it's full of twists and turns, setbacks, and ultimately that quest for a nation where everyone can thrive.
I can't wait to hear about it. Let's dive into post-independence Nigeria. 1960, Nigeria gets its independence, big moment. You'd think everyone would come together, celebrate, right?
You'd think so, but it was a lot more complicated than that. Those fault lines, the minority question, regional tensions, resources, they didn't just disappear.
Like all that pressure just exploded.
Yeah, and one of the biggest challenges was figuring out the structure of the country, how to make it fair for everyone. They started with 3 regions based on the dominant groups: Hausa Fulani in the north, Yoruba in the west, Igbo in the east.
But didn't that just make the imbalances worse? What about the smaller groups?
That's exactly it. They felt even more marginalized. Their interests were ignored, resources controlled by others.
So independence didn't bring everyone together like they'd hoped?
Not at first, no. It actually led to more demands for change. Those minority groups, they'd seen some success with their movements. They wanted more autonomy, control over their own future.
What do they do? Just keep protesting?
More than that, they started pushing for new states, carved out of the existing regions where they'd have a say.
So redrawing the map of Nigeria, that's a big ask.
It was, and it wasn't easy. Creating new states led to new conflicts, even between minority groups.
Sounds like a tricky situation.
It was. And then you add oil into the mix, discovered in the Niger Delta in the 1950s, things got even more complex.
Right, we talked about that, the oil wealth, opportunity, and conflict.
Exactly. Those groups in the Niger Delta saw all that wealth coming out of their land. They wanted a share. They were dealing with the environmental damage. They felt they deserved to benefit.
So the fight for political power and economic control all mixed together.
Exactly. And this fight over oil, it shaped Nigerian politics for years to come. Protests, rebellions, even corruption, everyone wanted a peace.
How did they even try to deal with all this, find some kind of balance?
There were attempts. In 1995, the Federal Character Commission was established. The idea was to make sure all ethnic groups were represented in government.
Did it work? Did it ease the tension?
It was a start, but not a perfect solution. Building a truly inclusive and equal society in a country as diverse as Nigeria, it's a process. Colonialism, ethnic and religious divisions, unequal wealth, it all keeps fueling these tensions.
So even today, Nigeria still faces some of those same challenges.
It does, but we have to acknowledge the progress, too. Nigeria has been through a lot: coups, civil war, economic crises, and yet it's still here, a resilient nation. The fight for a better society continues, and understanding this history is essential for understanding Nigeria today.
This has been an incredible look at Nigerian history. From its ancient beginnings to the complexities of the present, we've seen how the past shapes the present. It's a story of resilience, adaptation, and that constant search for a just and equitable society.
And it's not over yet. Nigeria's future is full of possibilities. It'll be fascinating to see what happens next.
Until next time, thank you for listening to Understanding Our History.